Okay, but I wanted to add one point to what Professor Dean said, and that is that we also, although it's gone through many processes in all the faculty boards, the students have two opportunities to make formal input and to impact on the policy. The two formal opportunities are in the Senate meeting, which will happen towards the end of May, and in the council meeting that will happen in June, where the SRC is represented. And so part of the reason for these meetings is so that the wider student community can also give feedback to the SRC and can give feedback to us directly. And I do want to say that if we hear good ideas or good critiques or good amendments, we still have opportunities to make changes. And so this is not just a one-way explanation of proposals, but an opportunity for us to hear your comments and your concerns, and also to see if we are perhaps missing something or not explaining it in ways that, or not understanding the concerns. Now, this is the outline of what I want to cover. It's really hard to understand the proposed changes without understanding our current policy. And in fact, not many people outside of those who work in admissions do understand our current policy, so I'm going to start with that. I'm going to say something about the reason or the problems that were identified with our current policy by the Howey Commission, a commission set up by Council some 2.5 years ago to review the policy and to see if it needed to, and they made some recommendations for changes, which has been a key driver for this initiative. The proposed hybrid model is the proposed changes, and then some implications of the new model. So the current policy has two phases. I just want to move this so I can see. And the first, in each year, they're divided in time. The first happens somewhere around April to June in the year. And what we do is we set targets, population group or race-based targets. I've put race in brackets, in inverted commas, to signify the fact that these are really the apartheid categories, the categories that were in the law with respect to redress, affirmative action, employment equity. We recognize that this is not a biological definition of race. It's a population group. But we go through the process of saying what are our current proportion of black, colored, Indian, Chinese, and white students in the first year class, and we set targets to try to achieve greater diversity, to try to get closer to a long-term goal where our student population will be more representative of the national population. In fact, our goal is not to be representative of the national population, but of a mixture of the national and the regional Western Cape population. And so we set those goals based on what we think is feasible. So, for example, if we know that there just aren't enough matriculants from a certain group with the necessary maths and science marks, then we don't set a target that can't be reached. And so it is historically informed by what we've seen applying to us in previous years, but it's also usually a stretch target. It's a target which makes progress. And we also set a minimum academic threshold for admission, below which we think students will probably not cope. And we never take students below that threshold. And that is based not on the targets or the affirmative action, anything else. It's based on our annual research of how students perform in the university based on certain marks that they get. And we use two sets of marks. We use their National Senior Certificate marks, and we use the National Benchmark Test marks, and we combine them to say this predicts success. Now, once that is done, there is a stage 2, which happens after students have applied, and that is really the procedure for implementing this, for achieving it. And that procedure requires, firstly, that all the applicants should declare their race. We call it self-declared race, self-classify themselves, because we have no law or mechanism for classifying students, and we can't do it. A court can't do it. Students have to do it themselves. And so on the application form, they fill in their race, what they consider their race to be, and Then when we get those application forms, we put them into race categories. So all the white students go into one category, all the colored students into another, Indian into a third, African into a fourth. And then we rank the applications within each category according to their marks, top to bottom. And then we select, going down that list, for a target number. And provided there are enough people above that minimum threshold that we've set, we would hope to achieve our target. Quite often, I would say very often, we don't have enough students above that minimum threshold. And so we can't achieve our target. And then we top up the class, obviously, from other groups. So that is why we don't always get the targets that we set. Some of the consequences of the current policy are the following. And this has been the policy for over 15 years. And in general, we would say it has served us well. It's relatively easy to set and to control for targets. If we want to have 30 colored students in a particular class, we have a basket of colored students and we have them ranked and we just take the first 30. So it's a relatively simple way and there's a direct relationship between the procedure and the outcome. We have made progress in most areas, and if you look at our numbers, we've had a lot of growth of our total student numbers over the last years. For example, between 2008 and 2012, the university has grown from 21,000 to 26,000. So there's been nearly a 20% growth of those students. And almost all of that growth has been in African students. The actual number of white students has remained constant in that period. Colored students have also grown, but not by the same proportion, and so the proportions do not reflect the same rate of change. But we've made good progress. Historically, this was a fair system. And what I mean by that is that race, which reflected apartheid structured racism and racial discrimination, was very closely aligned to disadvantage. It was the case that most African students were poor, and most African students were going to township or rural schools and were seriously disadvantaged, compared to most white students who were privileged, going to Model C or private schools and generally wealthier. And it was the case that Indian students were not as advantaged as white students, but much more advantaged than African or colored students. So there was a close alignment between race and disadvantage, because after all, what we're doing when we when we use affirmative action is we're trying to compensate for past disadvantage, for past discrimination, and therefore it was a fair system. Most black students would not have been admitted in the absence of affirmative action. So the policy was also a necessary policy in achieving these goals, because black students coming out of very disadvantaged schools were not competitive. In almost all cases, their marks were really much lower than the marks of white students, but not because they were not competent, but because of the schools they'd gone to. So this was a mechanism of drawing in a whole lot of black students effectively. And then the last bullet point is that it was effective in selecting students with potential from all groups, because the top marks in the country did not reflect the top talent and the top potential. The marks have a much closer relationship to the schools you go to and your background. And so selecting students who had the top marks but within a particular category was in fact selecting the top students. And those students with lower marks but might have been the top 1% of black students or of colored students were probably as talented or more talented than students who might have been in the top 5% of the white student group, but where even though the white students had higher marks. So this system of having race-based categories and selecting from the top of each category was also an effective way of selecting the very best students in the country. But increasingly over the years, the system has also developed some problems. And the first is that we are experiencing students now and we go to schools and we hear the principals saying to students, do not declare your race. UCT this is a racist practice on UCT's part. We've always believed in non-racism and non-racialism. We do not want to see the world through a racial lens. We do not always want to be thinking of ourselves in racial terms. And so there are a significant number of students now who do not declare their race. Now, if all of those students who don't declare their race, have to get put into the open category, which is the category that white students compete in. And so if all of those students are white students, nothing really changes. But in fact, increasingly some of those students are disadvantaged students. So students who should be getting the benefit of affirmative action might not be getting it. That's just one point. A second is that students may misrepresent their race. In other words, we're increasingly finding, and it's only when it's brought to our attention, that students who are Indian will classify themselves as colored in order to get the advantage of the affirmative action. White students may push the boundaries, and the problem is that we do not want to be in the position, our admission officers do not want to be in the position of looking at someone and saying, no, you're not actually colored, you're Indian. Or if you have the child, for example, increasingly, and this is the I haven't written this down, but increasingly we have children who are born post-1994, born of a mixed marriage. How do they get classified? And how do they classify themselves? Well, a child of someone who is white and Indian, parents might well say, well, I'm colored. We are not in the business of reclassifying people. So that's starting to become a problem. Thirdly, and very importantly, there's been a change in access to schools, whereas 20 years ago, very few African kids and colored kids were in Model C schools or in private schools. Now there are a lot of kids in those schools, and roughly nearly a half of the African students who come to UCT now are coming from, let me just call them good schools, schools that are not disadvantaged schools. And so what are the implications of that? Well, one of the implications is they're getting good marks, they've been well educated, and they don't need affirmative action. They don't need to be the beneficiaries of that old policy where they are treated differently, where they're treated as black and as disadvantaged just because they're black. And so the question we were asking is, does that policy, the old policy, still work for us? And we're also encountering students who, at UCT, black students who resent the fact that people view them as having been admitted through an affirmative action strategy, as having been admitted mainly because they're black, having been the beneficiaries of that. Whereas in fact, they did very well. They were in the top few percent of the province. They could have they did get in on their own accord, but the policy doesn't allow them to, because the policy automatically puts them in a category of black students or colored students. And so there's this sort of sense of stigma or resenting the implications when they don't need that. And then the fourth point on that slide is that there's an increasing sense of unfairness, and this is what we pick up in the newspapers particularly, and recognizing that this mostly comes from the white community, but that now that we have lots of black students at good schools with white students, students who have had the same educational experience for 12 years, often same socioeconomic background, are being treated differently according to their race when it comes to the admissions process. So we have lots of complaints from white students who have higher marks and don't get accepted, whereas their black classmates in the same classes have been accepted. And the students themselves and the families can't see that there's any difference in how advantaged or disadvantaged they are. And so there's this growing sense of unfairness in the way that the policy was administered. But the fundamental dilemma with the old policy is a much longer term one, and it's really, we could deal with the other things. We could just say, well, it's only a small number of people who are treated unfairly. It's a small number of people who lie about their race. It's really, that's not the fundamental challenge to our policy. The fundamental challenge is probably this one, which is that there's a dilemma about how we want as a society to move to become a more non-racial society. And there are broadly two ways you can do this, and scholars and policymakers and the public are divided on this issue. And the one is to say that we should deracialize society by ignoring race, by denying its existence, by not labeling ourselves in racial categories, and by not offering preferential treatment based on race. And the other group, the other view, which says we need to use race as the basis of redress, as the basis of leveling the playing fields, to benefit communities racially defined, that it's not primarily about individual fairness and whether an individual has had the benefits of a better education or a better income. It's about a community. So when we say we want to offer, in the employment equity legislation, we want to preferentially offer a black person a job rather than a white person, we don't interrogate at all how advantaged or disadvantaged they are, nor is it about the individual fairness to that person who may have been very privileged. It's driven by a view of a community, of leveling playing fields across communities, of community redress and justice. And so the old policy, the policy we still have, is driven very much by that second approach. But we think in the long term we want to move more to the first approach. We want to move to a society that's more non-racial. And so if we can modify our policy so that it moves away to some extent from a pure race-based approach, we think that is making progress in society. So the hybrid model, and we call it a hybrid model, that's the one that we're proposing, adds, it doesn't discard race. It still keeps race as one of the factors. And in fact, that phase one that I described of the policy where we set targets, the targets are set by race, because you don't have to classify each individual to set a target. We broadly know what we mean in society when we say we want to have 50% or 65% of the university students to be black. We know what that means. It doesn't present problems for us if individuals are not classified or can't classify. So the targets are set by race, and in fact the monitoring is monitored by race as well. But in addition to race, we look at other factors. And the approach uses three bands. We have a band A, B, and C, and band A is firstly aimed at selecting into UCT the various very highest achievers in the country, because one of our goals, I haven't gone through this because of time, when we said what should our new policy achieve, we developed some principles. One of the principles is that we want the very best students in the country, those who have performed the best, regardless of their disadvantage, regardless of their race. Part of being the best university in the country is recruiting those very top students. And so what we said is we want to have not a very large portion of the class or of the university, but about 15% who are selected just on the basis of their marks. That's the band A. Then we said we want to have another portion, and we think it's about 60%, who are selected on merit. Now, marks and merit are not the same thing, as we've already said, because marks reflects much more about your school that you went to and your home background. Merit is your marks taking account of the disadvantage, of the obstacles you've overcome. So it is a disadvantage-weighted point score. We take your marks and we push them up according to how disadvantaged you were. And then we rank you. And that means that someone with lower marks but with disadvantage will now be ranked above someone with higher marks and no disadvantage. But we think that the higher ranked person actually has more merit, more potential. So it's a merit-based system which takes account of disadvantage. Now, in that band B are many, many black students, black color, I'm using black generically now, black, African, colored, Indian, because most of the disadvantaged students are black students, and so those students' marks are being elevated. And so we're achieving much of the affirmative action by taking account of disadvantage in a way that is fairer across individuals, because It doesn't. It recognizes that people in the same circumstances would be treated the same, and people in different circumstances treated differently. And it brings in a large part of the class and a large part of the number of black and colored students. But then there's a third band, which is the way that we currently select students, which is the race. We've called it, I've called baskets there. I didn't use the word baskets before, but these categories, these baskets that we put students into based on their self-classification, that is still there, and that we find that that is necessary because we are not relaxing in any way our goals for diversity. And we find that if we only use these two mechanisms, we still have a significant number of black students who would not, there is such a gap between the performance of white and Indian students at the top of the scores, in other words, around 80-90%. And the bulk of black students who are coming from township and rural schools who may be getting 60s or 70s, that elevating their marks by disadvantage doesn't bring them significantly into the competition. Some of them come in, but not enough to achieve our targets. And that's why we still have a race-based band, and that is, and the goal is to ensure that the totals improve, that we achieve more diversity. Now, some of the criteria that we use for disadvantage in creating that disadvantaged score are there. And there really are, it's the school someone goes to, the education of their mother, father, and grandparents, particularly university education, or the absence of it, language spoken by mother at home, and financial indicators, in particular whether the family is the beneficiary of a social grant. And essentially, we cluster these disadvantage factors into home background factors and the school. And what we found is, and we take the higher of the scores, we don't add them together, because what we know is that almost anyone who has comes from a disadvantaged school also has a disadvantaged home background. And so we would just be double counting if we added those together. They already are disadvantaged by virtue of the school they go to. But if they're not going to a disadvantaged school, they may be disadvantaged from their home background. So we have the children of domestic workers who may be on scholarships at Model C schools. They are disadvantaged, but not through the school they go to. And it would be foolish to pretend that that disadvantage didn't count. And so the fact that their parents don't have university education or that their income is much lower gives them a score for the home disadvantage. And then we create an index out of 10, this disadvantage, and that is a 10 up to 10% increase on the mark. So if they had a score of 70% in the NSC or in the NSC-NBT combination, whatever we use, if they have a score of 70% and had the maximum disadvantage index of 10, then the final weighted score would be 77, 10% increase on their score. In the case of medicine, and I don't now recall if it was the other health science subjects, but in the case of medicine, the weighting is 20%. So it could go from 70 to 84. But in most of the faculties, we found that the appropriate weighting is 10%. So when we apply the model, this is basically what happens. I've chosen, and we've been testing the model by taking actual data of applicants in 2013, 2012, 2013. We're now repeating it for the 2014 applicants who got admitted in 2014 to see whether we get the same picture. So we take the actual applicants and we look at who did we select last year for 2013, and then we say who would we have selected in the model if we applied this, and we ensure that the results of the model are equal or better in terms of more diversity than the actuals that we had. So we want to be sure that we're not moving backwards in diversity. And I've just illustrated for you the outcomes from 2 different programs, because each program has a unique profile of applicants, and therefore it has to be managed differently. So in the case of a BCom degree, to get a good diversity of students, better than the current diversity, you would be able to select 32% of the class on Band A, just based on marks, 55% based on their disadvantaged weight score, and 13% based on the race-based baskets to tweak the class in a sense so that you have the desired outcome, to give you the 100%. In other words, 87% of the class in this case has been selected on a race-blind basis. Race is not considered at all in those first 2 bands. And that is, we think, progress in the sense of that dilemma we were pointing to. It moves us away from requiring everyone to classify themselves. In fact, most people would be able to get in without classifying themselves. It allows the black students who are admitted, especially if they're coming from good schools and they know that they've got good marks, they can be confident that 80-something% of them have been admitted without an affirmative action leg up. So we think it addresses some of the potential issues of stigma. It also means that all of these 87% of students know that they've been selected on a level playing field. Yes, disadvantage has been taken into account, but that's fair, as we've said. And it's really a merit-based system. But this band ensures that we can maintain the affirmative action need, because race still matters in society. Race counts. Racism is around, and a significant reason for poor performance is also racial stereotyping and racial discrimination. Now, in the MBBCH, you'll see the picture looks very different. And this is because we have a target, and we want to achieve that target. In the case of MBBCH, the number of African students and colored students that would be selected in these 2 bands is really very small compared to in commerce. And that's because the cutoffs are different. The mark cutoff for this band in commerce is somewhere around, somewhere around 80 or 78%. The mark cutoff in medicine is around 93%. And so the proportion of African students that are coming out of good schools, model C schools, getting into the 93% up band is zero, maybe zero, very, very small. Whereas the proportion of black students that are getting into this band is substantial. And so, therefore, far less depends on the bottom band. Similarly, in these bands, even when you add the disadvantage weighting, there are lots of white students who are slightly disadvantaged, and the disadvantage rating benefits them too. And so the number of black students that end up in this band is small. And so here you can see that more than half the class, 58%, would still be selected using race criteria as a significant criteria. I'm nearly finished that, and each program, each degree is different based on the traditional cutoffs that are required because of the competitiveness of the degree. Just to summarize, what are some of the advantages we think of the hybrid model? The first is that a substantial portion of the class is selected without the need for race classification. Secondly, it's flexible, and this is what I want to emphasize, that each program we can adjust the number that we put into each band and the cutoffs of each band, and through that flexibility we can achieve the race-based targets which remain. And in fact, I believe we can do better than we've done in the past. We can make more progress more rapidly than we've done in the past. Thirdly, it selects the top students from disadvantaged backgrounds, black and white. What was happening in the model that we currently use, the old model, is that black students were in their own category, and it was selecting the top students from the black category, but most of those students were coming from good schools. some of the black students with the most potential were not getting into that pool because they were not separately listed. They were just collected with all other black students. Similarly, amongst white students, there are white students who go to relatively disadvantaged schools. They haven't been to private schools. They haven't had the advantage of all the extra lessons and all of the input. Very talented and bright. But because we're only selecting the top 30 or 40 or so from white students, those students, white students who have a lot of potential, don't get selected. And so the university misses out on some of the best students in the country. By having the disadvantage weighting there, we are able to tap into that pool of really top white and black students and colored and Indian students there, who would not otherwise have been selected. Fourthly, very importantly, historically we've only talked about racial diversity, but this university is becoming more and more of a middle-class university as a result of the changes over the last 15 years. In other words, whereas in the past we were selecting black students and we could be sure that they were poor, and that was generating the socioeconomic diversity, as I mentioned just now, significant numbers of our black students and almost all our white students come now from very privileged backgrounds. And so to sustain or increase the socioeconomic diversity of the university, this approach helps do that. And it's also fairer, we believe, to students who in all other respects are equal, that there would not be an inappropriate advantage simply because of race. And I want finally to dispel the myths, and I think a lot of the debate, or try to dispel the myths, a lot of the controversy has been around myths, which it is a bit of a complex policy, and so I understand why these misperceptions would arise. But essentially, we are not discarding race. We're not discarding race, firstly, because we set race targets and we monitor them, and we have a significant band which could extend up to more than half the class if necessary in order to achieve our diversity targets. But we are supplementing race with other measures, or diversity-weighted merit. And the second point, the second sort of myth to dispel, is that we're not decreasing the number of black and colored students. In fact, we demonstrate through the modeling that we are the opposite, that we will be increasing them. So that's a quick romp through both the old policy, the motivation for the change, the new policy proposals, and some of the what we hope will be the benefits. And now we'd like to open it to questions of clarification, and then your comments. Shall I just stand here and take them out? Okay. Yeah.
Hi, sir. Jared Lunn. I'm a fourth-year medical student. It was interesting to see that medicine gets a lot of sort of preferential treatment in this new policy by, the adjusted score being now 20% instead of 10, and even in the third band there was some mention around differences for selection in med school. Is that purely based on what the sort of cutoff mark is, and hence what students are getting in, and therefore to address that, or if not, where did that come from?
First, you've already mentioned, which is how competitive it is to get in, but the second is the marked distribution of students, of the applicants, in different race groups. So, how am I going to do this? Okay, see if you can keep an imaginary line on the screen. So, if the marks are generally a normal curve for all students, and let's say that's around about 50%, so for black students, the marks will come here, and you'll get a few up in the 90s, and you'll get the bulk of them, of our applicants, say between about 70 and 85%. Now, in a degree like commerce, where your mark cutoff, just on marks, without anything else, would be about 70%, there are a lot of black students there, okay? And although there's also a lot of white students, if you give these students another 10% bonus for any disadvantage, then they become fully competitive. You have now you have the proportion of black and white students who are competing for those places is almost equal, and so on that basis you'll get a 50-50 class, let's say. In the case of medicine, you have a cutoff here at 94%. The number of black students there is very small, and when you give these a 10% bonus, they're now in the 80s, but they're still not in the 90s. Okay? So it makes no difference. When you do the 10% weighting, it actually makes no difference to the selection. You have to give a 20% weighting to get them in. When you do that, you start getting enough black students in that group. And as we know, you may say, wow, that's a big gap, but as we know, to get into medicine or to succeed in medicine, there's nothing magical about the school mark. And we know you certainly don't need 90%, you don't need 80%. In fact, that threshold that we established is somewhere around 70%. Anyone above 70% can get through a medical degree. And if you've got 70% at a disadvantaged school, then you're going to sail through your medical degree because you're actually a 90% student. So we're not worried about compromising standards when we push up the marks by 20%, as long as we don't go below our threshold.
Hi, I'm Ronan. I'm a fifth-year medical student. I would also just like to ask a little bit about the medical cutoff. I think the Band B and the A, B, and C system is an incredible system, and thank you to everyone who's put work into it. It really shows a lot of progress. What I worry about, and it's a discussion that we often have amongst our lecturers and tutors, is what kind of students are we bringing in if we're telling them that they need to have 94%? I think, as you said, a lot of people would agree that a good doctor isn't necessarily someone that's come out of high school with 90%. But what it seems as if still, and because I'm biased, because naturally I'm white, and I will ask questions about that as well, but are we bringing in white students that are very good academically, but we haven't considered anything else for their admissions into medical school? And then if we're bringing in black students that are disadvantaged but are still getting really good marks, are we just bringing in doctors that will get really good marks but might not necessarily be good doctors? And that seems to be a very competitive environment to bring people that essentially shouldn't be competitive but should be in medicine for the greater good and to serve South Africa and be willing to go and work in rural areas and work in government sector.
If I had my way, and I've said this to the faculty, we would select medical students with a lottery, with only having the threshold, and anyone above the threshold would be in a lottery, and we would only select, because I don't think we do the country any service by selecting people, by creating a system which selects people with very high marks. And a lottery would ensure that there was a wide spread, with some people with very high marks and some people with low marks. When I've proposed that, it generally meets with a very negative reaction, because people want to have a sense that they have some control over their destiny, that they can work harder or do something to influence their career. But I think we will get there, actually. I don't think it's so far away. In the meantime, you're absolutely right that the current system excludes anyone who doesn't have very high marks. Because whites, it excludes whites who don't have very high marks. There's no way you can get in without a 91% average plus. And so it's not just 6 or 7 A's, it's 7 A's with an average above 91%. That's what you need today. For black students, it wasn't having quite the same effect, because we were taking students from a much wider range of marks, but they were still those top students in their groups academically. What the modification does now is it brings in white students who are not having those top marks, but who have faced some sort of challenges or had some disadvantaged background, to the extent that, no one can say that means they have different values or that they would be more interested in rural work or different kinds of commitment. We don't have evidence that that's the case, but it does slightly spread the profile of those students. Similarly, amongst the black students, because some of them will have got in just on marks, some will get in disadvantaged weighted marks, and some will be getting in just on the basis of having been black and having come from, having not done as well because of the history of apartheid. I think we'll have a slightly wider spread there too. But it's not ideal, really. I know it isn't. Of course, sorry, I forgot. In medicine, it was only introduced, if you're in fourth year, it was only reintroduced after you applied. But for the last For this year and in future, the students who were admitted this year also had to fill in a personal report. And the personal report counts 10% of the total marks. And that 10% is often is make or break. Because the marks are so bunched up in the 90s, a 10% boost from the 80s or high 70s gets you in against someone who doesn't get anything there. And that looks at things like involvement in sport, in cultural activities, leadership activities, church activities, social activities. So we have been looking at that. Again, there I think we should also increase the weighting of that. The risk is that it's very hard to be objective, and it's easy to manipulate that data if you know how to play the game. And so we want to signal to students that we value that, and we want them to, but we can't really do much more than that. Yeah.
Hi, afternoon. My name is Tandan Mlambo. I'm a second-year medic. So my questions are, the first one is, if you were to, is it not because of degrees like medicine, we've got 220 places, that now we've got this need of changing the admissions policy? Because if we look at other faculties like humanities and commerce, whether we have the new admissions policy or not, we're still going to get that targets, and we're still going to get the racial groups which are there now. But then in terms of degrees like medicine, which are really highly competitive, and that is why there's a sort of, I wouldn't like to say pressure, but a need to change admissions policy because of the limited space that we have. Secondly, I remember a couple of years ago when you were still for the current admissions policy, you did mention, and I'd like you to mention it now, the difference between black students who are at private schools and who are affluent, and how they perform as compared to the same kind of students who are non-black, and how they perform, with everything being the same, socio-economical, same school, and how the performance varies. And the last question is, in terms of your rating of mother's education, father's education, now, do they both have equal weighting, or are they different? Bearing in mind that we've got the case of, I don't know many of you know, Hugo versus President, where it was proven that a mother plays a better role in a child's upbringing in their life as opposed to a father. So now, if they're going to have, the two are going to have the same weightings, or are they going to have different weightings? I don't know if you thought about that. Thank you.
So I just want to say that my view, or my opinion is not changed. It's the same as it was before with respect to whether the playing fields are really level. When students have spent, black and white students have spent the full 12 years in the same school. So not all of you will be familiar with the argument. I'll just try to summarize it quickly. When we look at the results, or when we did 2 or 3 years ago, when we last looked at the results of black students and white students who had all been at the same good schools for their whole lives, and we looked at the 30 feeder schools, the 30 top feeder schools of UCT, you might have expected that there would be no difference in the distribution of marks of black and white students, because they're all, in a sense, equally privileged educationally, and the fact that they're in those schools, they may be equally privileged socioeconomically. But what we found was that black students were generally had lower marks than the white students by approximately 7 percentage points at that time. And so you have to ask the question why, and in fact, we didn't really have to look hard for answers, because this is a phenomenon that's found all over the world, that it takes a couple of generations for that difference to be eliminated, because it's not just the school that influences how you perform. And very importantly, your parents' education is a key factor. Now, it's because of, and in other words, the kids who are at, say, private schools, black kids at private schools, will often have parents who have not been to university, or who have not had the same, not just whether they've been to university or not, because it's not so magical about being at university, but the schooling system we have is a very Western-oriented schooling system, and it's built on Western cultural precepts. And a whole lot of the things that a white child takes for granted because it's part of their language, part of their discourse, part of their parents' history, a black kid would be strange and alien to a black kid. And so, and then there's also language. So if you grew up from birth speaking English, you always have an advantage in an English language school compared to having grown up with parents who first and foremost speak Xhosa, and you are then adapting. And that's why we've tried to cater for that in our model by saying those students, they may have been at good schools, but they can still get the disadvantage rating and the boost of points if any of their parents lack a university education, or if their parents speak as a home language, an indigenous language other than English, or of course if they come from a poor background. And we think that that will compensate for much of that residual legacy of disadvantage that you see in the school system. Not perhaps all of it, because another factor which is the hardest to cater with is stereotypes. So if you're in an environment in a good school, where somehow the stereotype is that black students will not do as well as white students, it's the expectation of the teachers, or it's the expectation of parents, or it's the expectation of society, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And in fact, the students don't perform as well. It's very well demonstrated with respect to boys and girls writing maths exams. There's often an expectation in schools that girls can't do maths as well as boys, and then they don't do as well. And there's social psychology research which shows that if you can change the expectation, if you tell girls that they're going to do a test which has been demonstrated to be where girls perform better than boys, the same test, they'll do better. So part of this is about racism in society, which changes your performance. And so that can't be catered for simply by looking at your parents' education or other things. In some ways, that does get catered for in the band C, because those students who may be falling out of the system, of our selection process, still get a look in, or still get selected through the third band, because they will be at the top performers in that race-based band. So I think I feel confident, and we've demonstrated it through the trials, that both by looking at the home disadvantage and by the band C, we can ensure that those students do not suffer disadvantage or are not deselected out of the process. Now, you asked me something else. I've only answered the first part of your question. What was the second?
I asked you about the different ratings between the mother and the father.
Okay, so that's the same. We
also
don't wait.
The need. Why is it that?
Yeah.
Is it because of health sciences only?
Okay, yeah. So in the different ratings, we based the ratings on some research we did, and in the research we did, we didn't find that there was a difference. In fact, we included grandparents, and grandparents also came out. So I forget now what the actual point is, but I think you get 1 point if you would get 3 points if neither your grandparents or your parents had a university education. If one of them has, then you get 2 points. If two of them have, you get 1 point, and if none of them have, and if three of them have, you get 0 points. And it has to be done that way because many kids will not have a father around, or they won't know who their father is, and they won't know what their father's education is. And so it has to be the presence of a parent or grandparent that has education that loses you the point, if you know what I mean. And the absence of that gets you the point. Is it being driven just by medicine? No, you're right that much of the flack that we get from the public, is around medicine, and that's because the gap between the marks of black and white students who get selected, although they're all above the threshold, they're all above the 70%, but the gap is big. It can be 20 percentage points. And the gap in other faculties is much smaller, but there's still a gap, and there's still the same sort of problem. And there are 4 other programs which are very competitive: the Bachelor of Business Science, the PPE degree, architecture, psychology, for example, and engineering. One of the engineering degrees, I forget which it is, where it's similarly competitive, where the cutoffs are in the 80s. And so it is a general, it's not only driven by medicine. The public pressure is from medicine. But what we're trying to do is what we think is the right thing. We've resisted the public pressure in the past, and if we thought there was no reason to change now, I think we would continue to resist the public pressure.
All right. Well, are students that belong to or come from 2 different racial backgrounds be considered in this new policy? And will it be possible in future to take more than one racial box?
Very interesting question. At the same time, at the moment, there are 4 categories: African, colored, Indian, Chinese, and white. Chinese because of the law which classified Chinese people as not white. We, at the moment, say, please classify yourself. We don't get involved. So you have to choose one of those 4 categories or the open category if you don't want to choose a category. So we don't create new categories. In the past, under apartheid, those were the categories. And if you were the child of an Indian and a white parent, well, of course, you couldn't legally be that. But if you were, then you were classified into the darker color. So you were classified as Indian. If it was Indian and colored, you were classified as colored. So if you wanted to know how was it done, and if you wanted to copy that, that would be the approach. But there are no extra categories. In parallel with this change that we're making for possibly 2016, we made another set of changes which are being implemented right now for 2015. And that was this question of how people should be classified, because there's such a resistance and unhappiness about people having to classify themselves that we've changed it to say, the question now says, how were your parents classified under apartheid? And and you asked, how was your mother classified? How was your father classified, if you know? And so you could then put your father colored, mother Indian, or whatever they were. And now we don't then classify the student or the applicant. We have redress categories. So we have a redress category, which is redress categories 1, 2, 3, and 4. And in effect, the category you go into is based on your parents' classification.
Thank you. I've written my question down. It says, how are you going to make sure that people do not cheat the system about their background, parents, and their education, just as they do with NSFAS? Because you find that with NSFAS, people are going to be like, I have a grandma and grandpa, they do not work, they both rely on pension, yet they have both parents working in very high positions. That is happening.
Yeah. It's a tough question. I think that we've tried to choose measures that the ones that have a lot of weight, the ones that carry many points, are ones that we can test fairly easily. So, for example, the school is easy to verify because we get the marks, we know which school you were at. Language is fairly easy to test because if you can't speak the language you say you grew up with fluently, then it's not plausible. So if people start lying about their mother tongue, we would say in the form, we can test these things, and if we test and you find that you've lied to us, we withdraw the offer. We already say that in our forms. Education, we would probably test on a random, like an audit basis, when there's a measure of suspicion. We already find that people are watching each other. So we get a lot of complaints. I'll tell you this, but off the record, I think. We get complaints, for example, from people who were at school with their friends and say, so-and-so has been offered a place and I haven't, or my child hasn't, but my child got better marks, and we both Indian. So I want you to investigate whether that person classified themselves as colored or something else. And then we do investigate that. So to some extent we rely on being alerted to this or a measure of suspicion. It's actually much harder to force the issue around race. I mean, you know, in the Western Cape, what is colored and what is Malay and what is Indian? There's no clear distinction. With education, what we would do is, there are very few people with university education these days who are not, in some ways, don't have a presence on the internet. And if you just Google, you'll find references to they may have Facebook and LinkedIn, they may have jobs, their CVs are on the internet, And because of the public information, and we've been testing this, it's quite easy to find. And what we will probably need is we'll probably need kids to tell us what their parents' names, the name or ID numbers are of their parents, so that we can do that sort of verification if we need to. So I think we can sort out school, we can sort out language, we can probably sort out education, although that will be a bit more iffy and it doesn't carry that many points as a result. Income is in some ways the hardest. What we were going to say is that you have to show us that you are the recipient of a social grant. So you have to provide the proof of it. So we're not going to say, tell us you're poor, or tell us that you have no income, or tell us that your parents are unemployed. You have to show us that you're actually the recipient of a social grant. And in other words, we are relying on the social welfare system to do the testing, to decide that. Now, no doubt a lot of people are crooking the social welfare system as well, but there's only so much that we can do. And if you then come to university and you're driving your own car, then we'll have to investigate it again. But it's not worse than our current system. I hope it'll be better.
I just want to ask if the university has ever considered screening students.
Just put the microphone a little bit closer.
Okay, sorry. I just want to ask if the university has ever considered screening students scholars from maybe grade 11 or 12 where they, I know like...
What do you mean screening?
Basically, I read something on the internet of a student in the US who was offered a place from all of the Ivy League schools and based on their mark on grade 11. Maybe that might be influenced because universities in America are competing for students where it might not be the case in South Africa, where maybe students are given provisional places at the university, or they are given a chance to compete among themselves right from grade 10, 11, and 12 of the place, or something of that sort, instead of having a one-shot selection method on a metric.
Right. I'll just give you 3 things that we do. All students are judged first on their grade 11 results when they apply, because we have to make a decision before they've written their final exam. So in most cases we make a provisional offer, and we say as long as your final results are better or the same, we'll confirm the offer. So we do look at the grade 11 results, and that's the most important thing. The second thing we do is we say to students who don't succeed, if you write the exam again, we will consider you again. So you do also have a second chance if you want to rewrite your matric or rewrite some of the subjects. You can also do that. The third thing we do is we have an outreach program, and I don't know if this is perhaps what you're referring to, where at the moment it's only in Khayelitsha, but in all 20 high schools of Khayelitsha, we ask the principals in grade 10 or grade 9 to identify the top students, and from the start of grade 10, we bring them onto campus every Saturday for extra classes, and we have teachers who teach them. We also bring them on for summer and winter camps, where they come for a week onto campus every holiday for 3 years, and then we have intensive revision. That program started 4 years ago, and the first cohort finished their school in 2013, and a very high proportion of them, all of them passed NSC. About 85% got a B degree pass, means they could come to university. Not all of them came to UCT. They could go, of course, to any university. And out of the total group, we've got about 77 who have come to UCT, compared in previous years to less than 20 from the whole of Khayelitsha. And so we're very proud of this particular program. I don't know if that's what you're referring to, but that's an example of one of the areas where we try to sort of improve the pipeline of students coming to us. Okay, we've gone over 2. So there's going to be a link. There is a link on the website where you can send comment. You'll also be able to download this presentation if you want it. You'll be able to download a text version of what we're saying, and we would welcome any comments that you want, positive or negative, or questions that you want to ask. Thanks very much for coming.